Marcus Thompson had always been drawn to the roar of engines and the freedom of the open road. At 28 years old, he owned a modified Harley-Davidson that had been his pride and joy for nearly 5 years. The motorcycle wasn't just transportation for Marcus, it was his escape from a life that had become increasingly complicated and frustrating. Working as a warehouse supervisor in East London, Marcus struggled to make ends meet despite putting in overtime nearly every week. His small flat barely accommodated his basic needs, and the mounting bills seemed to grow faster than his paycheck. The motorcycle represented the one luxury he refused to give up, even when his girlfriend Sarah constantly nagged him about the expense of maintaining it. The tension between Marcus and Sarah had been building for months. She wanted him to sell the bike and use the money for a deposit on a better apartment, maybe somewhere they could start planning a future together. But Marcus saw things differently. The motorcycle was his sanctuary, his way of clearing his head after long days dealing with demanding supervisors and ungrateful coworkers. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, Marcus had gotten into another heated argument with Sarah before leaving for work. She had discovered that he had spent their grocery money on new chrome exhaust pipes for the bike, and her reaction was explosive. The fight escalated quickly, with harsh words exchanged on both sides. Sarah accused him of being selfish and immature, while Marcus defended his right to spend his own money as he saw fit. The workday that followed was no better. Marcus's boss, Mr. Henderson, had been particularly critical of his performance lately, questioning every decision and micromanaging his every move. During the morning meeting, Henderson publicly criticized Marcus for a minor inventory discrepancy that wasn't even his fault. The humiliation in front of his co-workers was the final straw in what had already been a terrible day. By lunchtime, Marcus was seething with frustration and anger. His usual lunch spot, a small cafe near the warehouse, was crowded and noisy, adding to his irritation. As he sat alone picking at his sandwich, he replayed the morning's events in his mind. The fight with Sarah, the humiliation at work, the constant financial pressure, it all seemed to be crushing down on him at once. After lunch, Marcus made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of returning to work, he called in sick, claiming he had food poisoning. Mr. Henderson's skeptical tone over the phone only fueled Marcus's resentment, but he didn't care anymore. He needed to get away, to feel the wind in his face and the power of his motorcycle beneath him. Marcus retrieved his bike from the warehouse parking lot and began riding through the streets of London with no particular destination in mind. The familiar vibration of the engine and the sound of the exhaust pipes provided some relief from his stress, but the anger still burned inside him. He rode for nearly an hour, weaving through traffic and taking turns at random, letting the motorcycle carry him wherever it would. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself in central London, an area he didn't usually visit on his bike due to the heavy traffic and strict parking restrictions. But today, he didn't care about rules or restrictions. The anger and frustration that had been building all day seemed to be clouding his judgment, making him more reckless than usual. It was then that Marcus noticed he was low on fuel. The gauge on his motorcycle showed that he needed to find a gas station soon, or risk being stranded in the middle of the city. He began looking for the nearest station, but the combination of heavy traffic and unfamiliar streets made navigation difficult. His frustration levels rose even higher as he realized he might have to push his bike several blocks if he ran out of fuel. The chain hanging from Marcus's belt had been a part of his biker image for years. It was a thick, heavy chain that he had attached to his wallet, more for show than practical purposes. The chain had become such a natural part of his appearance that he rarely thought about it anymore. It clinked softly as he walked and created a distinctive sound when he rode his motorcycle, adding to the authentic biker persona he had cultivated. However, on this particular day, the chain seemed to be catching on everything. It had gotten tangled in his jacket zipper that morning, caught on his chair at work, and now seemed to be hitting against his leg more than usual as he shifted on the motorcycle seat. The minor annoyance was just another irritation in what had already been a thoroughly frustrating day. As Marcus continued searching for a gas station, he found himself riding through some of London's most prestigious areas. The grand buildings and well-dressed pedestrians were a stark contrast to his usual neighborhood, and the difference only served to remind him of his own financial struggles. Here were people who probably never worried about grocery money or whether they could afford to maintain their vehicles. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he was riding through areas where people lived the kind of life he could only dream of, while he was skipping work and, potentially risking his job just to deal with his frustration. The expensive cars parked along the streets and the designer shops lining the sidewalks seemed to mock his own modest circumstances. Traffic began to slow as Marcus approached a major intersection. The stop-and-go movement was particularly annoying on a motorcycle, especially one with a heavy clutch like his Harley. His left hand was beginning to cramp from the constant clutch work, and the heat from the engine was becoming uncomfortable in the congested traffic. As he waited at a red light, Marcus noticed a group of tourists taking photographs near what appeared to be some kind of government building. The tourists were excited and chattering loudly, pointing at various architectural features and posing for pictures. Their obvious joy and excitement contrasted sharply with Marcus's dark mood, making him feel even more isolated and angry. The light turned green, but traffic moved only a few feet before stopping again. Marcus's patience was wearing thin, and he began to consider taking a different route, even if it meant going out of his way to find fuel. The constant starting and stopping was making his motorcycle run hotter than usual, and he was worried about potential engine problems if he continued in this traffic pattern. It was during this moment of hesitation and frustration that Marcus's life took a turn that would haunt him forever. As he sat on his idling motorcycle, surrounded by the grandeur of central London and consumed by his own anger and disappointment, he had no idea that the next few minutes would transform him from an ordinary working man with everyday problems into someone whose actions would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shock witnesses, make international headlines, and serve as a stark reminder of how quickly a moment of poor judgment can destroy a life. Marcus Thompson, warehouse supervisor and motorcycle enthusiast, was about to make the biggest mistake of his existence. The traffic finally began to move more steadily, and Marcus found himself approaching what he now realized was Buckingham Palace. The iconic building rose before him, its imposing facade drawing crowds of tourists and onlookers. Marcus had never paid much attention to royal ceremonies or traditions, but even he recognized the significance of this place. Standing guard at their posts were the famous royal guards, resplendent in their red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. These soldiers, known officially as the Queen's Guard, were members of elite military units tasked with protecting the royal residences. Their stoic presence and unwavering discipline had made them as much a tourist attraction as the palace itself. Sergeant James Wellington had been serving as a royal guard for 3 years. At 26 years old, he was a decorated soldier who had served tours in Afghanistan and had earned his position through exemplary service and rigid discipline. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace was considered an honor among his regiment, and James took his duties with the utmost seriousness. The royal guards were trained to remain motionless and silent regardless of weather conditions or outside distractions. They were not supposed to react to tourists, photographers, or any other civilian interactions unless there was a genuine security threat. This training required incredible mental fortitude and physical endurance, qualities that James possessed in abundance. James had been on duty for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, standing perfectly still in his designated position while tourists photographed him and occasionally attempted to make him smile or react. He had learned to tune out the constant chatter and camera clicks, focusing instead on his surroundings and any potential security concerns. The protocol for royal guards was explicit and non-negotiable. They were to remain at attention, eyes fixed straight ahead, responding only to direct orders from superior officers or genuine emergency situations. Any breach of this protocol could result in severe disciplinary action, including removal from the prestigious position. Marcus continued riding slowly through the area, his fuel gauge now showing that he was critically low on gas. The frustration of being unable to find a station was compounding his already volatile mood. The sight of the palace and the crowds of seemingly carefree tourists only intensified his feelings of resentment and displacement. As Marcus approached the area where James was standing guard, traffic came to another complete stop. A tour bus was attempting to navigate the narrow street, causing a backup that stretched for several blocks. Marcus found himself stuck directly in front of the palace, his motorcycle idling loudly in the quiet afternoon air. The sound of Marcus's modified exhaust pipes was particularly prominent in this setting. The deep, rumbling roar that he usually enjoyed now seemed inappropriate and attention-grabbing. Several tourists turned to look at the motorcycle and its rider, some taking photographs of what they probably assumed was another colorful London character. James, maintaining his rigid posture and forward gaze, was aware of the motorcycle's presence but remained focused on his duties. He had dealt with countless distractions during his time as a royal guard, from crying children to aggressive tourists, and had never broken protocol. The sound of the motorcycle was just another element in the urban symphony that he had learned to ignore. However, Marcus interpreted the guard's stoic stance differently. In his current state of mind, the soldier's unwavering gaze and perfect posture seemed to represent everything that was wrong with his own life. Here was someone who appeared to have purpose, respect, and stability, everything that Marcus felt he lacked. The chain on Marcus's belt clinked as he shifted uncomfortably on his motorcycle seat. The prolonged idling was making the engine hot, and the heat was becoming uncomfortable. His leather jacket, which had felt good in the cooler morning air, was now making him sweat. The combination of physical discomfort and mounting frustration was pushing Marcus toward a breaking point. As the minutes ticked by with no movement in traffic, Marcus's anger began to focus on the guard standing just a few yards away. In his distorted thinking, the soldier's composure and dignity became symbols of the authority figures who had been making his life difficult: his boss, his landlord, even Sarah with her constant demands and criticisms. Marcus began to stare directly at James, willing him to acknowledge his presence. The rational part of his mind knew that royal guards were trained not to interact with civilians, but rationality was in short supply at that moment. Marcus felt ignored and dismissed, emotions that resonated with his experiences throughout the day. The tourist bus finally managed to clear the intersection, but instead of moving forward with the rest of traffic, Marcus remained stationary. He continued to stare at the guard, his anger building with each passing second. The chain on his belt seemed to grow heavier, and he found himself unconsciously touching it with his right hand. James, despite his training, began to sense that something was different about this particular civilian interaction. While he couldn't see Marcus directly due to his forward-facing position, he could hear the motorcycle continuing to idle when traffic had clearly moved on. His peripheral vision caught glimpses of movement that seemed more agitated than the usual tourist behavior. Other tourists in the area began to notice the standoff as well. A middle-aged couple from Germany stopped taking photographs of the palace to observe the motorcycle rider who seemed to be fixated on the guard. A group of teenagers on a school trip pointed and whispered among themselves, sensing that something unusual was developing. Marcus's grip on his motorcycle's handlebars tightened as his anger reached a crescendo. The combination of his terrible day, his financial stress, his relationship problems, and his general dissatisfaction with life had created a perfect storm of rage that was now focused entirely on the composed soldier standing before him. The chain attached to Marcus's belt had become an extension of his fury. What had started as a fashion accessory was now transformed in his mind into something else entirely. The weight of it in his hand felt significant, powerful, a way to assert himself in a situation where he felt powerless and ignored. In the crucial moments before everything changed forever, Marcus made a series of decisions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He turned off his motorcycle's engine, kick-started the stand, and dismounted. The sudden silence after the rumbling exhaust pipes drew even more attention from nearby tourists and passers-by. James, trained to assess potential threats, recognized that the situation was escalating beyond normal tourist interaction. However, his training also dictated that he maintain his position and composure unless directly ordered to do otherwise or faced with an immediate threat to royal security. Marcus took several steps toward James, his hand now firmly gripping the chain. The tourists who had been casually observing suddenly realized they were witnessing something serious. Several people began reaching for their phones, some to call for help and others to record what appeared to be an impending confrontation. The afternoon sunlight glinted off the chain as Marcus raised his arm. In that moment, suspended between action and consequence, everything seemed to slow down. The bustling sounds of London traffic faded into the background, and the only thing that mattered was the space between an angry man with a chain and a disciplined soldier sworn to protect the crown. What happened next would be captured on multiple cameras, analyzed by security experts, and debated by legal professionals. But, for Marcus Thompson, it would simply be the moment when his life as he knew it came to an end, replaced by consequences he never could have imagined when he first climbed onto his motorcycle that morning. The chain whistled through the air with a metallic swoosh that cut through the afternoon silence. Marcus had swung it with all the force his anger could muster, aiming directly at Sergeant James Wellington. The heavy metal link struck the Royal Guard's shoulder with a sharp crack that echoed off the palace walls and sent a collective gasp through the gathered crowd of tourists. James staggered slightly from the unexpected impact but managed to maintain his footing. Years of military training and physical conditioning had prepared him for many scenarios, but being attacked while on ceremonial duty was not something he had specifically anticipated. The blow had been painful and shocking, but his immediate concern was following proper protocol while ensuring the situation didn't escalate further. The tourists who had been casually taking photographs suddenly found themselves witnesses to an unprecedented assault on one of Britain's most symbolic institutions. Cameras and smartphones immediately turned toward the scene, capturing every moment as Marcus stood with the chain still in his hand, apparently as surprised by his own actions as everyone else present. A woman from Australia screamed and grabbed her husband's arm, pointing at Marcus with obvious distress. "He just hit the guard. Did you see that? He actually hit him." Her voice carried across the area, alerting other tourists and passers-by who might not have witnessed the initial attack. Within seconds, dozens of people were converging on the scene, some to help and others simply to satisfy their curiosity about what was happening. Marcus looked at the chain in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. The reality of what he had just done began to penetrate the fog of anger that had driven him to this point. The weight of the metal link suddenly felt enormous, and the shocked expressions on the faces surrounding him started to bring him back to his senses. But it was far too late for regrets or second thoughts. James, despite the pain in his shoulder and the unprecedented nature of the attack, maintained his training and composure. He knew that any reaction from him could potentially escalate the situation and put civilian lives at risk. The protocols for dealing with security threats were clear: remain calm, assess the danger, and await backup while protecting the public and the royal premises. The sound of whistles began to pierce the air as other guards stationed nearby responded to the commotion. Within moments, additional royal guards were moving toward the scene with the practiced efficiency that their training demanded. Their red tunics and tall hats created a striking visual as they approached, weapons at ready but not yet drawn. Marcus realized that he was now surrounded by an increasingly hostile crowd and approaching guards. The full magnitude of his actions began to dawn on him as he saw the serious expressions on the faces of the military personnel moving in his direction. This wasn't just a moment of anger anymore, this was a criminal assault on a member of the British military while they were performing official duties. A teenage tourist from France had been recording the guard with his phone when the attack occurred, and the entire incident was captured in high-definition video. The footage showed Marcus approaching the guard, raising the chain, and delivering the blow with shocking clarity. Within minutes, this video would be uploaded to social media platforms and begin spreading around the world. Police sirens could now be heard approaching from multiple directions. Someone in the crowd had immediately called emergency services, and the response was swift and comprehensive. Metropolitan police officers were racing toward Buckingham Palace with the knowledge that an assault had taken place at one of London's most significant and protected locations. Marcus dropped the chain, and it clanged against the pavement with a sound that seemed unusually loud in the tense atmosphere. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, tourists horrified by what they had witnessed, guards approaching with obvious intent to detain him, and ordinary Londoners who had stopped their daily activities to stare at the unfolding drama. The first police officers to arrive on scene were part of the specialized protection unit responsible for royal security. These officers were trained for exactly this type of situation and approached Marcus with professional caution. They had been briefed via radio about the assault and were prepared to handle a potentially dangerous individual who had already demonstrated a willingness to attack government personnel. "Step away from the weapon and put your hands where we can see them," commanded the lead officer, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations. Marcus looked down at the chain on the ground and, then, back at the officer, the reality of his situation finally becoming completely clear to him. James finally allowed himself to examine his shoulder where the chain had struck. The impact had been significant, and there would definitely be bruising, but he appeared to have avoided serious injury. His main concern now was ensuring that the incident was properly documented and that the security breach was handled according to established procedures. More police vehicles arrived, their blue lights flashing and sirens adding to the chaos of the scene. Traffic in the area came to a complete standstill as officers worked to secure the perimeter and gather witness statements. What had started as a routine afternoon at one of London's busiest tourist destinations had transformed into a major security incident. Marcus raised his hands slowly, his mind racing as he tried to process the consequences of his actions. The anger that had driven him to this point had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread about what would happen next. He could see his motorcycle sitting nearby, a reminder of the freedom he had been seeking when this all began. The crowd of witnesses continued to grow as word spread about what had happened. Tour guides stopped their groups to point out the scene, and local news crews began arriving to cover what was already being described as an unprecedented attack on the Royal Guard. The incident was rapidly escalating beyond a simple assault case into a matter of national and international interest. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell arrived on scene as the senior investigating officer. She had 20 years of experience with the Metropolitan Police and had handled numerous high-profile cases, but an assault on a Royal Guard was unusual even by her standards. Her immediate priority was ensuring that the scene was properly secured and that all evidence was preserved for what would undoubtedly be a closely scrutinized prosecution. Marcus was handcuffed and placed in the back of a police vehicle while officers began the process of collecting witness statements and gathering physical evidence. The chain that had been the weapon in the assault was carefully photographed and bagged as evidence, along with Marcus's motorcycle and any personal belongings that might be relevant to the case. James was examined by paramedics who had arrived with the police response. While his injuries appeared to be minor, protocol required a thorough medical evaluation and documentation of any physical evidence that might be needed in court proceedings. The assault had been witnessed by dozens of people and recorded on multiple devices, but proper medical documentation would be crucial for the prosecution. As Marcus sat in the police car, he could see the continued activity around the scene of his attack. Officers were interviewing witnesses, collecting evidence, and coordinating with Royal Protection Services to ensure that security protocols had not been compromised. The magnitude of what he had done was becoming increasingly apparent with each passing minute. The news of the assault began to spread beyond the immediate area as social media posts and news reports started appearing online. The video recorded by the French tourist was already being shared widely, and news organizations were beginning to pick up the story. What Marcus had intended as a moment of personal release had become a public spectacle with international implications. Within hours, Marcus Thompson would be facing charges that could result in years in prison. His moment of anger had transformed him from an anonymous warehouse worker into someone whose actions would be analyzed and condemned around the world. The mistake of a lifetime had been made, and there would be no way to undo the consequences that were now rapidly unfolding. The holding cell at the central London police station was nothing like what Marcus had imagined from television shows or movies. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast everything in a sickly pale glow, and the concrete walls seemed to amplify every sound. As he sat on the narrow bench that served as both seat and bed, Marcus replayed the events of the afternoon over and over in his mind, each time hoping he might remember them differently. Detective Inspector Mitchell had conducted the initial interview with professional detachment that somehow made the situation feel even more serious. She had methodically gone through the facts of the case, starting with Marcus's actions that morning and leading up to the assault itself. The weight of evidence against him was overwhelming: dozens of witnesses, multiple video recordings, and physical evidence that left no room for doubt about what had occurred. The charges against Marcus were more serious than he had initially understood. Assault on a member of the armed forces while on duty carried significantly harsher penalties than a simple assault charge. Additionally, the location of the attack and the symbolic importance of the Royal Guard meant that the case would be treated with particular gravity by both the legal system and the media. Marcus's phone call to Sarah had been one of the most difficult conversations of his life. Her initial disbelief had quickly turned to shock and, then, to a kind of disappointed resignation that hurt more than anger would have. "I knew that motorcycle would get you in trouble eventually," she had said quietly, "but I never imagined anything like this." The conversation had ended with Sarah telling him that she needed time to think about their relationship and what this meant for their future together. The legal aid solicitor assigned to Marcus's case was a tired-looking man in his 50s named David Pemberton. During their first meeting, Pemberton had been brutally honest about Marcus's prospects. "The evidence against you is overwhelming," he had explained. "Multiple witnesses, video evidence, and the victim's testimony. Our best option is to plead guilty and hope for leniency based on your clean criminal record and genuine remorse." The media attention surrounding the case had been swift and intense. The video of the assault had been viewed millions of times within 24 hours of being posted online. News outlets around the world had picked up the story, and Marcus found himself being described as everything from a motorcycle thug to a symbol of social breakdown. The international embarrassment caused by attacking one of Britain's most recognizable symbols had made the case a matter of public interest far beyond its legal implications. Marcus's employer had wasted no time in terminating his employment. Mr. Henderson had called personally to inform him that his actions had brought disgrace to the company and that his services were no longer required. The termination was effective immediately, and Marcus was told not to return to collect his personal belongings, which would be mailed to him. 20 years of steady employment had ended with a 5-minute phone conversation. Sergeant James Wellington had made a full recovery from his physical injuries, but the psychological impact of the attack had been more significant than initially anticipated. In his victim impact statement, James had described feeling violated and vulnerable in a way that his military service in combat zones had not prepared him for. The attack had occurred while he was performing ceremonial duties, unable to defend himself due to protocol restrictions, which had created a particular sense of helplessness. The court proceedings had been swift and decisive. Marcus had followed his solicitor's advice and pleaded guilty to all charges, hoping that his cooperation and remorse might result in a lighter sentence. However, the judge had been clear that the seriousness of the offense and its impact on public confidence in the security of royal institutions required a substantial custodial sentence. During the sentencing hearing, Marcus had been given the opportunity to address the court directly. His statement had been brief and sincere, expressing his deep regret for his actions and acknowledgement of the pain he had caused to Sergeant Wellington, his family, and the institution he had attacked. "I have no excuse for what I did," he had told the court. "It was a moment of madness that I will regret for the rest of my life." The sentence of 18 months in prison had been accompanied by a restraining order preventing Marcus from approaching any royal residence or ceremonial guard post. Additionally, he would be required to pay compensation to Sergeant Wellington and cover the costs of the additional security measures that had been implemented following his attack. The first few weeks in prison had been the most difficult period of Marcus's life. The other inmates had little sympathy for someone who had attacked a member of the military, and he had faced both verbal abuse and threats of physical violence. His solicitor had eventually arranged for him to be moved to a different wing for his own protection, but the isolation had brought its own challenges. Sarah had visited once during his second month of incarceration. The meeting had been awkward and painful, with both of them struggling to find words for a situation that seemed surreal. She had brought news that their landlord had evicted her from their flat due to the media attention and that she was staying with her sister while looking for a new place to live. The motorcycle had been sold to help cover the legal costs and outstanding debts. The prison library had become Marcus's refuge during his sentence. He spent hours reading books about anger management, meditation, and personal responsibility. The prison counselor had helped him understand the underlying issues that had contributed to his explosive behavior that day: his financial stress, relationship problems, and general sense of powerlessness and frustration. Through his reading and counseling sessions, Marcus began to develop a different perspective on the events that had led to his imprisonment. He recognized that the attack on Sergeant Wellington had not been an isolated incident but, rather, the culmination of months of poor decisions and unaddressed emotional problems. The motorcycle, which he had seen as a symbol of freedom, had actually become a way of avoiding the real issues in his life. The anger management program offered by the prison had been mandatory for Marcus, but he had approached it with genuine commitment to understanding and changing his behavior. The program had taught him techniques for recognizing the warning signs of explosive anger and developing healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with stress and frustration. As his release date approached, Marcus had worked with social services to develop a plan for his reintegration into society. Finding employment would be challenging given his criminal record, particularly for an offense that had received so much media attention. However, a local charity that worked with ex-offenders had offered him a position in their warehouse, contingent on his successful completion of anger management and community service requirements. The day of Marcus's release was gray and drizzling, fitting weather for what felt like the beginning of a very different life. The few possessions he had accumulated during his imprisonment fit easily into a single bag. As he walked through the prison gates, he was met by David Pemberton, who had continued to provide legal support throughout his sentence. Remember, Pemberton had told him as they walked to his car, "The media attention has died down, but this will follow you for the rest of your life. Every job application, every background check, every time someone searches your name online. You need to be prepared for that reality." Marcus had moved into a small bedsit in a different part of London, far from the areas where he might be recognized. The flat was basic and cramped, but it represented a fresh start and the possibility of rebuilding his life. He had no television and limited internet access, preferring to avoid any reminders of the media coverage that had made him briefly infamous. The charity job had proven to be both challenging and rewarding. His supervisor, a former offender himself, understood the difficulties of reintegration and provided support and guidance as Marcus adjusted to life outside prison. The work was similar to his previous job but with better support systems and a focus on helping others who had made serious mistakes. Sarah had eventually agreed to meet Marcus for coffee several months after his release. The conversation had been civil but distant, and it was clear that their romantic relationship was permanently over. However, they had been able to find some closure and even a tentative friendship based on their shared history and mutual respect for the growth they had both experienced. The restraining order meant that Marcus could never again visit Buckingham Palace or witness the changing of the guard that continued to draw millions of tourists each year. This permanent reminder of his actions served as both punishment and motivation to ensure that he never again allowed anger and poor judgment to control his behavior. Years later, Marcus would often think about Sergeant Wellington and wonder how the attack had affected his life and career. Through his solicitor, he had learned that James had continued his service with the Royal Guard and had eventually been promoted, but Marcus knew that he had no right to contact him directly or seek forgiveness for an act that could never truly be forgiven. The motorcycle that had been such an important part of Marcus's identity was gone forever, sold to pay for the consequences of that terrible afternoon. He occasionally saw similar bikes on the street and felt a pang of nostalgia, but he also recognized that giving up that particular symbol of freedom had been necessary for his personal growth and development. Marcus's story became a cautionary tale used in anger management programs and discussed in criminology courses as an example of how quickly a life can be destroyed by a moment of poor judgment. The video of his attack continued to circulate online, a permanent record of the worst moment of his life that would never truly disappear. The mistake of a lifetime had cost Marcus his job, his relationship, his freedom, and his reputation. But it had also forced him to confront the underlying issues that had been building toward that explosive moment. In rebuilding his life from nothing, he had discovered strengths and insights that might never have emerged if he had continued on his previous path. The chain that had been the weapon in his attack had been destroyed as evidence, but Marcus carried the memory of its weight in his hand as a reminder of how heavy the consequences of anger can be. His story served as a warning to others about the devastating impact that a single moment of rage can have on multiple lives, and the long journey required to rebuild trust and respect after such a profound betrayal of social norms and human decency.